For today, we have two sessions. The first will be geared to learning lessons from our experience over the past decade. And then the second session will look forward to consider how the IEO should prepare for the future, both in terms of the issues we need to tackle and the approaches to take to ensure impactful evaluations. In our presentations, we on the IEO staff will indeed be brainstorming. We'll raise a number of issues and challenges that we face, and we'll make a number of suggestions on how the IEO could continue to evolve in order to strengthen our contribution to the fund. And we very much look forward to hearing comments and reactions to our presentations from the panelists and also you in the audience. Some logistical points. Well, when we started planning this conference, we thought we would be all together, but unfortunately we're in virtual format. I will miss seeing you all in person, but on the other hand, we are going to be able to take advantage of a virtual format to bring in people from a wider range of physical locations and time zones. So I think that is actually a tremendous advantage to be more inclusive. But to reflect the virtual format, we've limited the length of our sessions. We'll try to be concise and to the point so that we're able to finish each day by around 1 o'clock Washington time. We may go on a little bit longer, but we'll try to end by the latest 1:15. And we hope that we will, within that format, still have time for contributions from our virtual audience. And if you'd like to come in with a comment or question to the panelists or the presenters, please use the chat box function, which the moderators will be monitoring. I should also mention that this conference is a public event. We are recording it, and we're going to post the recording on our website. Okay, so let's begin session one, and I'll turn to Kalpana Kochhar, who will moderate the session. Kalpana knows the IEO very well from her time on the fund staff, where among many responsibilities, she was for a while the main staff counterpart for the IEO in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department for a number of years. She also worked in her long career at the fund and in the Asia Department and in the Research Department, and most recently as Director of Human Resources. But she left the fund a few months ago to go work at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as the Director for Development Policy and Finance. And I'm sure she's already gained new perspectives on the fund and potential role for the IEO in that new position. So Kalpana, thanks so much for joining us, and let me turn right over to you to moderate this this first session.
Thank you, Charles. You all can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, and I'm actually very pleased to be moderating this session. The title of the session is Looking Back, the IEO's second decade, and where specifically we're going to look at the question of whether the IEO has helped the IMF do its job better over the last decade. Charles will go over this in more detail, but I found it useful to remind myself that the IEO is intended to do three things: enhance the learning culture within the fund, strengthen the fund's credibility, and support the executive board's institutional governance, oversight, and governance and oversight responsibilities. So I'm actually going to be looking, when I'm listening to Charles make his presentations, for how the IEO has actually done that, and how well they've done it, and what comments you have on that. Now, so let me just, we'll have the presentation by Charles. I believe he'll take about 20 minutes or so to walk us through what the IEO has accomplished in its second decade. And then right after that, I will invite In the following order, our distinguished and knowledgeable panelists to discuss some of the issues raised by Charles in the presentation. First, I will call on Mr. Tombini, Alexandre Tombini, who, as many of you might know already, he was the chief representative of the BIS Office for the Americas. And then before joining the BIS, he was actually the executive director at our board for Brazil, and prior to that as the governor of the Central Bank of Brazil. After Mr. Tombini has given his comments, I will turn to Moises Schwartz. Moises is also known to all of you. He's a special advisor to the vice president of sectors and knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank. Before that, he held the position of the director of the Independent Valuation Office. So we can expect to get some, pretty deep insights from him on the working of the IEO and his assessment of how well it's done. Before that, he also served as executive director at the IMF, representing, among others, Mexico, his own country, Mexico. And then last but not least, I'm going to ask Sean Hagan to come in. Many of you know Sean Hagan from his time at the IMF, where he was general counsel for 14 years, and where he is now a visiting professor of law at Georgetown. So I'm going to ask the panelists to take about 7 minutes or so. I'll remind you of that again. And then I will leave a good amount of discussion, good amount of time for discussion when we come back. I will try to impose a hard stop at noon, but maybe a few minutes after we will go. But just to keep to what Charles said, which is a pretty tight timeline. Okay, with that, over to you, Charles, to make the presentation, and then I'll come back to moderate this.
Thanks so much, Kalpana. This presentation reflects on the IEO's experience in its second decade and will aim to set the stage for a discussion of lessons learned from this experience. It's based on a paper that I'm writing with Ruben Lamdani for a book that we are preparing on the IEO's second decade. Try to fully align our views in this presentation. I'll start by giving a brief primer on the IEO's work, then lay out the main developments over our second decade, including steps to introduce new evaluation products and to strengthen the follow-up framework. And then I will discuss two key questions arising from our experience. First, what has been the IEO's impact on the fund's work? And second, how should the IEO's work agenda be set? And in particular, how much attention should be paid to issues of current concern? And I'll end up by suggesting some issues for discussion. Now, most of you participating in this conference are already pretty well aware of the IEO, what we do and how we work, but it may be helpful to start with a very brief primer. As the managing director just mentioned, the IEO was established 20 years ago in the wake of the Asia crisis, which became a crisis for IMF credibility and legitimacy, as well as for the Asian region. As the MD also mentioned, we have three tasks in our terms of reference: supporting board oversight, supporting institutional learning, and helping to strengthen external credibility. It's worth recognizing up front that there are some tensions among these goals, particularly the first two, similar to that faced by the IMF more generally, between being a ruthless truth teller in offering our assessments and being a trusted advisor trying to help the institution learn from experience. I'd also like to stress that an evaluation office is different from an inspector general or a compliance auditor. The IEO's primary function is not making sure that the IMF is following internal rules and procedures in particular cases, but to provide an open-ended assessment of how well the IMF as an institution is accomplishing its mandate. Core principle that allows us to play our role is that the IEO is fully independent of staff and management and has an arm's length relationship with the board. Now, I'm glad to say that in my experience, this independence is fully protected by our governance framework that's provided by our terms of reference. And finally, I'd like to emphasize that we're not just about producing interesting reports to sit on a bookshelf, but rather to foster institutional change. We are actually much smaller than counterparts at the World Bank and other multilateral development banks and produce far fewer reports, but we feel we can have a large impact by being strategic in the issues that we evaluate and by having a very robust follow-up process to our evaluations. Now, as we look back over the second decade, the fundamentals of how we work have stayed broadly unchanged. The innovations have focused on adding ways to respond more nimbly to current concerns and to reinforce the follow-up process to increase the impact of the IEO's work. Over the decade, we have completed 15 evaluations covering all major areas of the fund's work and relevant to all groups of members. We've added 2 new products. Evaluation updates were added in 2012 to come back to an evaluation after around 10 years to assess progress made in addressing concerns and identify new challenges. And shorter evaluations were introduced in 2019 on a pilot basis to provide more timely input on evolving issues and concerns. One shorter evaluation has been completed so far in less than a year, rather than the usual 18 months to 2 years that it takes for our more comprehensive reports. On the follow-up process, continued efforts have been made to strengthen the follow-up. These include requiring that the management implementation plans, or MIPs, be prepared by staff within 6 months of the board discussion. The content of the MIPs have to be SMART, as the managing director mentioned. That is to say, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Third, since 2015, the Office of Internal Audit, the OIA, has been tasked with preparing the annual review of progress and implementing MIPs, which is now discussed by the full board. And fourth, the triage process was undertaken last year on a one-off basis to address a significant backlog of action items that were off track, leading to a commitment to reformulate some key action items. Efforts have also been made to increase our impact by enhancing awareness of our work and learning from our work through greater outreach, both outside the fund and inside the fund. These efforts have been accelerated by increasing use of webinars to reach out to a wider audience, such as this conference today, taking advantage of increased comfort with virtual meetings in the wake of the pandemic. Many of these adaptations to the evaluation processes have responded to recommendations by 3 external evaluations that have been completed, 2 in the last decade, the Ocampo report in 2013 and the Cabaruca report in 2018. These reports have played a very valuable role by providing external evaluation of the independence, quality, and impact of the IEO's work, and by advocating for further strengthening of the evaluation function at the IMF. The COVID pandemic has been challenging for the IEO, as for everybody else. As the fund shifted to emergency mode to address the needs of the pandemic, there were some delays in bringing evaluations to the board and in the follow-up in the face of these pressures. But we are now largely back on track. And as the managing director mentioned, I think we did help during the pandemic period to help the fund learn from past experience of crises. Also, we've adapted our work processes and the coverage of issues to reflect the new challenges, including launching an early evaluation of the fund's emergency response to the pandemic itself. So let me now turn to the key question of what has been the impact of all this evaluation activity on the fund. Now, there are many different levels at which this impact can be assessed. First, one can look at the record of implementation of the board-endorsed management implementation plans, the MIPs. Second, one can look at concrete changes in IMF policies and practices more generally. And third, one can consider the broader impact of evaluation on the fund's culture and governance arrangements, including the role of the executive board and protections for the integrity of the fund's data and technical work. Let me turn first to the record with the MIPs, which is assessed every year in the periodic monitoring report, the PMR, prepared by the Internal Audit Office, OIA. The 11th PMR has just been completed, illustrated in the panel on the left here. It covered 122 actions in 10 MIPs completed over 2012 to 2020. And it actually found very good implementation of recent plans, which has been, I think, particularly impressive, given the continuing work burden on the staff from the pandemic. In all, 79 actions were judged to be complete and 19 on track for completion. However, there were also 16, mainly older actions, overdue by a year or more, in part because of pandemic delays in the work program. Plus, there are 8 actions that are now waiting to be reformulated under the terms of the triage exercise to deal with the backlog of incomplete actions that was conducted last year. This reformulation is expected to occur by the end of this year. But let me go beyond this numerical exercise of completion of action items to highlight some of the ways in which IEO evaluations have influenced IMF policies and practices in recent years. And here I'm really following in the footsteps of the managing director. And it was interesting that she indeed emphasized in a number of ways that the IEO has had influence that very much mirror our own assessment. On this slide, I've listed a number of changes in board-approved policies where IEO evaluations have played a part. These include increasing limits for rapid financing to enhance the fund's capacity to help fragile states, the new framework on social spending after our evaluation of social protection, a new strategy on data and statistics, new frameworks for program design and currency unions, and for collaboration with regional financial arrangements following the Euro area crisis evaluation, and a new risk-based process for selecting countries for financial stability assessments following our financial surveillance evaluation. IEO evaluations can also impact IMF capacity and practices more generally. For example, the report on fragile states led to reinforcement of efforts to increase the capacity development work in fragile states and to incentivize staff working on these countries. And last year's reports on financial surveillance and unconventional monetary policy led to hiring of new staff to expand the fund's expertise in these areas at the core of the fund's work. At a deeper level, evaluation can lead to changes in corporate culture that over time can address underlying behaviors embedded in the institution's fabric. Such issues are hard to fix with magic bullet solutions from a single evaluation, but can be gradually influenced over the sweep of evaluations. A retrospective prepared at the end of the IEO's first decade identified a number of themes that recurred across multiple evaluations. These themes have continued to be a focus in the second decade. Some progress has certainly been made. For example, over the past 10 years, the fund has, I think, become less susceptible to silo behavior as efforts have been made to increase work across functions. Attention to risk has been enhanced, including through a new Office of Risk Management, the ORM. And there's also been continued efforts at ensuring even-handedness, particularly in the surveillance context. In other areas, though, I have to say the progress has been somewhat constrained by the need to balance different objectives. For example, increasing attention is paid to country context, but at the same time, evaluations that we have done have continued to raise concerns about too rapid turnover of country teams, which hinders the depth of country knowledge. I'd also like to highlight 2 new themes that have recurred in recent evaluations. The first is concern about the lack of depth of specialist expertise in the fund's core areas, such as financial issues and monetary policy advice, suggesting that the fund needs to invest more in nurturing cadres of world-class experts on such topics. This has been happening, but is constrained by budget and the continuing reliance on fungible macroeconomists as the core model for fund economists. Second, as the fund is increasingly recognizing the macro criticality of issues like climate that were traditionally outside the fund's core expertise, it has to work more with partner institutions. The MD herself emphasized the importance of this more effective collaboration. However, we have found in our evaluations, the work with partners on issues like climate has in fact been quite uneven and often not brought much return, which seems to reflect both the difficulty of collaboration across institutions with different mandates and business practices, and in part a culture of self-reliance at the fund. So this is an area for us of rising concern. Another way in which the IEO contributes is by supporting the executive board oversight over the institution. Note that the IEO is the only office or department reporting to the board fully independent of management, which is unlike the OIA and ORM. How do we support board oversight? First, we provided an effective instrument for traction. The MIPs are based on the board discussion of the evaluation, reflect the views of executive directors, and have to be approved by the board. They then have regular follow-up, as I mentioned, in the PMRs, which again must be reviewed by the board. Second, the IEO supports institutional memory and perspective. The median tenure of executive directors is less than 2 years and declining. Moreover, typically executive offices are fully involved with immediate operational issues, particularly those covering a large number of countries, many using fund resources. And third, we provide a channel to reflect concerns and views of members outside the largest shareholders and can provide the board with alternative perspectives on issues to what EDs receive from staff. So can the IEO do more to support the board? Well, we are working in this direction. The continuing strong interest among EDs in more timely input from the IEO led to the introduction of the shorter evaluations, and there was very keen board support for the early evaluation of the IMF's pandemic response. But I think there could be scope for the IEO to move further in this direction, to do evaluation work on timely issues without interfering with operational activities, which is required in our terms of reference. Now, this is quite a difficult line to draw, as I will discuss in a moment. Also, there are concerns which have been raised by staff about whether the institution has the capacity to fully absorb and follow up on more than 2 or so evaluations each year. Also, there could be scope for more IEO interactions with the board on issues related to follow-up on past evaluations. For example, the IEO could offer comments on how board papers prepared by staff as part of implementation plans respond to issues raised in the original evaluation. To do this effectively, the IEO would need to be more closely engaged with the staff's ongoing policy work, which could raise concerns about the adequate separation of the IEO from the work it is evaluating. A related question is how the IEO supports the institutional integrity of the IMF's data and technical work. It should be recognized that political considerations must inevitably play a part in IMF decision-making, particularly on its lending operations, since the fund is an institution deploying public resources responding to member needs. Nevertheless, the fund's legitimacy, credibility, and ultimately effectiveness depend on ensuring that such decisions are based on technical work with the highest standards of impartiality and institutional excellence. The IEO is one of many mechanisms of the fund seeking to safeguard such institutional integrity through its examination of IMF analytical research and data work and the fund's decision-making activities. Some past evaluations have found evidence of undue political interference, particularly in difficult program situations involving high levels of access. Examples include the 2016 evaluation of the Greek program, the 2004 Argentina evaluation, and the 2003 capital account crisis evaluation. More generally, however, evaluations have confirmed high technical standards in IMF analysis and serious efforts at being even-handed in treatment of different members in similar situations. Over the past decade, evaluations of IMF forecasting, IMF research, IMF data work, IMF advice and capital flows did not raise concerns about political interference in technical work. There were, on occasion, mistakes and misjudgments, but they were more often ascribed to groupthink or institutional inertia shared among management, staff, and shareholders, rather than undue political pressures on technical work. Is there scope for the IEO to do more to safeguard institutional integrity? I think the answer must be yes, but it's also important to recognize the constraints on what the IEO can achieve. The IEO typically does not look at difficult cases for many years due to limits in evaluations of ongoing operational activities. There's also agreement that the IEO should not do evaluations solely on single country cases, but instead on engagement across a range of related cases to maximize opportunities for institutional learning. As I mentioned earlier, there can be a tension between learning and accountability functions. What is the right balance? IEO experience has shown that political challenges to integrity are often difficult to prove conclusively. Moreover, even when a problem is identified, it's hard to find an appropriate remedy, as shown by experience following up on the Euro area crisis evaluation, where a recommendation to take steps to reduce political interference with technical work did not have much traction. Let me now turn to how we set the IEO's work agenda by choosing topics for evaluation. With scope for only a limited number of topics, topic selection must be strategic and geared to ensuring relevance and impact. In practice, we're careful to consult very broadly with the main stakeholders to identify issues of current concern. The board discusses a menu of options in an informal seminar. Management, staff, and outside stakeholders are also consulted, and the topics chosen are typically ones in which the board has strong interest and where an IEO evaluation can provide timely input into staff's own policy review work. The board, management, staff, and external stakeholders are also consulted in preparing a detailed issues paper to make sure the scope of the evaluation is well set, reflecting the broad range of concerns. Timing is a particular challenge in choosing topics, since many important and relevant IMF policies have only just been changed or are being actively reviewed, and the IEO has to be careful to avoid interfering with operational activities. This interference clause in our terms of reference was included from the outset when the IEO was set up, out of concern that evaluation could potentially interfere with delicate negotiations between the fund and members on a current or future program. New shorter evaluations that we've now introduced should in principle be helpful to allow more nimble responses to respond to evolving priorities. The first pilot shorter evaluation of bank fund collaboration on climate and other macro structural issues was successful in delivering a well-regarded assessment, not hampered unduly by its narrower focus. Could we do more to ensure timely and relevant evaluations? We could go further to focus on shorter, more quickly completed evaluations. But as I mentioned before, this approach could put heavy pressures on the fund's absorptive capacity, which is a particular concern given the current very continuing intense work pressures. Another change would be to reconsider the clause in our terms of reference that requires the IEO to avoid interfering with operational activities. In practice, I have to say that the interference clause has usually not been a major constraint, especially for evaluation of surveillance and capacity development work, but it has sometimes been a factor in setting the timing and scope of a number of evaluations over the years. While appreciating concerns about possible interference, application of the interference clause too zealously could lead to excessive delays and curtail the IEO's capacity to address issues related to current institutional priorities. This issue is a difficult one. It's been discussed in successive external evaluations, but no consensus has been achieved at the board on more precise language for the terms of reference. So my final slide now will raise a number of topics for discussion. The overarching question is, how can the IEO increase its overall impact? And I'd like to put 4 suggestions on the table. First, the IEO could be more involved in the follow-up process, working more closely with staff and the board. Second, the IEO could shift the product mix towards more timely evaluation of issues of current concern, possibly after some consideration of the non-interference clause. Third, the IEO could pay more attention to integrity issues. We can look for lessons from past evaluations, and we could pay more attention to integrity aspects as we embark on new evaluations in areas where integrity issues can be particularly prominent, for example, on exceptional access policy. And then finally, the IEO itself could collaborate more closely with other evaluation offices in partner institutions on issues where the fund is itself working closely with partner institutions. And that may be a way to increase the impact of our work in this area. In each of these cases, I think there are pros and cons that would need to be very carefully considered. The challenge is getting the balance right between different objectives and effective deployment of limited resources in the IEO, but also in the fund. And hopefully this IEO 20 conference can contribute to this discussion. Thanks very much. Back to you, Kalpana.
Thank you, Charles. That was very comprehensive, and I definitely think you landed on the right questions that many of us are grappling with. But let me now turn over to Mr. Tombini, Alexandre Tombini. Reminder, you've got about 7 minutes or so. Over to you.
Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you, Charles and the IEO, for inviting me to be part of this ephemerides, which is the 20th anniversary of the IEO. So I had the privilege to work with and follow up closely the IEO during my tenure as board member between 2016 and 19, and especially my period as first member and then chair of the evaluation committee of the board. At the start of the period, the IEO at 15 had already consolidated its reputation and credibility. Everyone, I think at that time, recognized the quality and the relevance of its work for the IMF. But some issues still require improvement. The traction of the IEO, that is the capacity of the IEO to effectively influence. Do you hear me? Okay, so I'll keep going then. There was an echo here. So the traction, I think, was an issue. The capacity of the IEO to effectively influence the work and policy of the fund was still relatively limited. We also needed to address some of the shortfalls in the follow-up process, as was flagged by Charles in his introduction. So during my tenure as chair of the EVC, I was responsible for coordinating the third external evaluation of the IEO, which led to the so-called Kaberuka report, named after the Rwandan economist Donald Kaberuka. In the process, the report identified many concrete steps to strengthen the IMF internal evaluation function. The Kaberuka report indeed put the issue of traction at the center of the debate. It suggested that in the previous 15 years, the IEO had not been very successful as a vehicle to promote a learning and adaptive culture within the fund. Large organizations, as we all know, tend to be resistant to changes, and the IMF is not different. Although we all probably agree that the IMF is an extremely well-organized and effective institution, it nonetheless tends to operate under silo mentality and insular culture, as the IEO framed in a 2011 evaluation. How to truly improve the IEO traction has been its main challenge after it had consolidated its credibility and reputation. And I think that thanks to Charles and his team, and thanks to the IMF management and board members, a lot more has been achieved recently. For instance, the IEO has made a great effort to reach out to different stakeholders, including and especially IMF staff. It was important to make it clear to IMF staff that the role of the IEO is not to investigate, but rather to evaluate. Or to say it differently, the IEO is not a cop, it's a partner. I'm confident that the IEO in-reach and outreach efforts are paying off to change this old perception within the fund. To be relevant, is also fundamental that the IEO chooses evaluations that are not only pertinent and of interest to the IMF, but also provide useful insights. And fundamentally, the evaluation recommendations need to be clear, measurable, and attainable, or smart to say it differently. And this is another area in which the IEO has made a lot of progress in the past decade. In addition to fully fledged evaluations, the current menu of IEO products includes short evaluation and periodic updates. These allow, as was mentioned by Charles, and I agree, to respond swiftly to changing challenges and convey a stronger and more coherent message to the institution. Another area in need of improvement was the follow-up process of the IEO recommendations. In this regard, strictly adhering to the agreed implementation timeline is key. During my tenure as chair of the EVC, and with the support of the Secretary, I sought to follow the timelines with no exception. The management implementation plan is expected to be discussed by the EVC no later than 6 months after the board meeting of each IEO evaluation, and the periodic monitoring report, PMR, meetings should be held regularly every year. Ownership and accountability of management and the board members regarding the follow-up process is also essential. And I believe that the Kaberuka report recommendation to have a board meeting to discuss the periodic monitoring report was very useful to enhance both ownership and accountability in the process of following up IEO recommendations. Before I turn to Charles' questions, let me highlight one specific evaluation during my tenure at the EVC that I believe is a good example of what works well and shows the importance of consensus building. I refer to the 2019 evaluation on financial surveillance. This evaluation highlighted the importance of strengthening financial surveillance at the fund, including through expanding financial surveillance coverage in Article 4, consultations, strengthening the financial stability assessment program, and hiring and retaining financial sector specialists at the fund, among other recommendations. The facts and the reasoning behind these suggestions were very well documented. In the process, there was a lot of collaboration between the IEO and relevant departments, and between the IEO and the board. And during the discussions at the EVC, there was a lot of consensus regarding the recommendation and the way forward. These elements, clear and useful recommendations, cooperation amongst all parties, and consensus building are precisely the elements that help make the work of the IEO relevant for the institution. So let me turn to your questions, Charles. The first one is, should the IEO be more involved in the follow-up to its reports? I think more IEO involvement would be very welcome. It could help avoid that the IEO recommendations fall into oblivion. The board's agenda, as you mentioned, is very busy. Board members have a large number of pressing issues to focus on, and board turnover is high. Without a strong and rigorous follow-up process, the IEO recommendation can easily get lost. This risk could be reduced if the IEO, in addition to the EVC and the board secretary, get involved in the follow-up on the recommendations. The second question is whether the IEO product mix should be shifted toward more focused and more timely evaluations on issues of current concern. Of course, as you mentioned, this has been a highly discussed issue in the board and in previous external evaluations, and this could run the risk of being seen as interfering with current work of the IMF. But I believe that the advantages outweigh this risk. Not only will a shift towards more timely issues give the evaluations more traction and visibility, and such evaluations could also improve IMF policies. A good test case, as we heard from the managing director today, it seems that you have the support for these short evaluations in the IEO, is the IMF emergency response to the COVID pandemic that I'm looking forward to seeing the result of this one. So I might stop there, Kalpana, and get back to the remaining two questions if you think so in the second round. So in the interest of time, I pass the floor back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexander. Let me now turn to very interesting comments. I've made some notes to come back to them, actually. So, but before I do that, let me turn over now to Moises. Moises, you also have about 7 minutes, which and we'd really look forward to hearing your views.
Yes, can you see me? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, good morning. It is really a pleasure to join you this morning and take part in the IEO's 20th anniversary conference. Of course, thank you, Charles, for the invitation. I am delighted to virtually see so many IEO and IMF colleagues and to be joined in this panel by esteemed friends and colleagues, Kalpana, Alexandre, and Sean. I vividly remember all the conversations we used to have with only one purpose in mind, namely to make the IMF and the IEO stronger, more effective, and more credible. In his presentation, Charles has already provided some background, numbers, and results of the IEO second decade. There is no doubt the IEO has established itself as a body that supports the executive board oversight of IMF performance, helps the IMF to learn from experience, and supports the fund's external credibility by increasing transparency about what the IMF does. And on the overarching question on how the IEO can increase its overall impact on the institution, Charles suggests alternatives along the lines that the IEO could be more involved in the follow-up process to its evaluations, shifting the product mix towards more timely issues of current concern, paying more attention to integrity issues, or perhaps for the IEO to collaborate more closely with other evaluation offices on issues where the IMF is working closely with partner institutions. All of these are relevant possibilities that need to be carefully considered. However, in my remarks, I want to bring the attention to another element that has not been mentioned. Actually, the managing director mentioned it a little bit, so I'll get a little bit more into the detail of it. But to me, having spent 7 full years as director of the IEO is the most fundamental element for the IEO success, an element that still needs to be further developed. Some of my thoughts appear in a book I produced during my time at the IEO. My message is the following. The IEO has basically 2 different audiences. An external audience that includes authorities in member countries, other international organizations, academia, and the public at large. And an internal IMF audience, mainly IMF management and staff. On the external front, results are encouraging. While more can still be done along the lines of Charles' suggestions and more outreach, externally, the IEO is credible and respected. I clearly remember the anticipation and expectation from external stakeholders on some of the most critical evaluations the IEO has produced. Nonetheless, on the internal front, for the IMF to truly benefit from the IEO's work, the learning process derived from IEO's reports needs to grow more naturally and organically within the fund. That is, the IMF as an organization needs to see the IEO more as a learning and useful device and less as simply as an accountability mechanism. Staff and IMF management have met many of the IEO reports with concern, anxiety, and defensiveness, thus shifting the IEO's emphasis more towards a learning device for the organization would go a long way in developing a culture that truly learns and benefits from independent evaluation. Hence, the strategy I recommend has basically 2 elements. One rests solely on the IEO's responsibility, and the other on the IMF's attitude towards independent evaluation. On the IEO side of the equation, while the 2 pivots of accountability and learning need to be present in IEO reports, the learning component in IEO reports needs to be emphasized. This would reinforce the learning objective of independent evaluation and ease the defensiveness from staff derived from the accountability pivot. That is, while the proper balance between learning and accountability would still need to be struck, the learning component should prevail. On the fund's part, the IMF still needs to genuinely embrace independent evaluation by creating a more open culture to learn from IEO's reports. And this needs to come from the top. That is, management needs to fully embrace the benefits of independent evaluation by creating an atmosphere and culture within the organization that is more welcoming to independent evaluation. I understand the staff's attitude towards the IEO. While some staff are supportive, the staff at large tends to be defensive. This is obvious. Staff tends to be dismissive of what it perceives to be an outsider suggestion on how it should do its work. While director of the IEO, I remember we held a seminar with some guests to discuss these same type of issues. Hector Torres, a former executive director and friend of the IEO, and maybe Hector is attending this seminar today, said a phrase that stuck in my mind during my tenure as IEO director. At some point in the conversation, Hector said the following: "Unsolicited advice is never welcome." To me, this is precisely the point here. Through its report, and for 20 years now, the IEO has been providing unsolicited advice to the IMF. Hence, staff defensiveness is totally expected. Each one of us would respond in exactly the same way, both in a professional or personal context. For instance, if an acquaintance tells me I should lose some weight, my immediate reaction would be to ask him to mind his business, even though his advice may be the most appropriate one. Our own reaction in this case would simply result from the fact that we would see this as intrusive and as unsolicited advice. My point here is that staff's defensiveness towards IEO reports is totally understandable and expected. However, contrary to staff's response, defensiveness should not be IMF management's attitude. Management must assume the role of promoting the IEO within the fund, transmitting its usefulness and value to the organization, encouraging staff to apply for IEO jobs, and continuously being open to the suggestions and recommendations that the IEO provides to the organization. Management should adopt a positive attitude towards IEO reports, even if it does not agree with some of their findings and recommendations. Make use of these reports to promote change within the fund, instill positive receptiveness in staff's attitudes towards the IEO, and ultimately make the IEO's mission its own. Management's involvement is crucial, so that a culture of learning from independent evaluation within the fund is entirely developed. Only then will the IMF fully benefit from independent evaluation. The IEO and the fund are bound together, and they need each other for the successful implementation of their respective work. But this partnership still needs to be strengthened. The IEO has grown in stature and lent credibility to the work of the fund. Its presence has enabled those outside the organization to see the fund as becoming a more accountable institution, learning from the past and adapting to new challenges. I have no doubt that independent evaluation has played a significant role in contributing to the improvement of the IMF. A strong IMF requires a strong IEO. Let us then make sure that the IEO keeps being strong and relevant in the years to come. I do not want to expand myself here. To me, the bottom line is that for both the IMF and the IEO to continue to excel, there is still some work to be done in reaping the benefits from independent evaluation. Thank you, Kalpana, and hopefully I'll have the opportunity to get into some of these points in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moises, and thank you also for keeping to time, more or less. So Sean, over to you, our last discussant, and then I'll come back with some comments on what you all have said. So 7 minutes for you, Sean.
Thank you, Kalpana, and thank you, Charles, for organizing this conference and for having included me. You know, while my understanding of the IEO naturally was formed while I was on staff, I must say that as a teacher, I have really grown to appreciate the value that these evaluations provide. I use them in all my courses. You know, it's not surprising that the IMF, given its importance, has many critics and commentators, but the IEO, I think, enjoys two advantages that makes its analysis particularly valuable. First, because it has an in-depth understanding of the IMF's mandate, i.e. what is the IMF supposed to be doing, it's really in an excellent position to identify where its activities fall short of those objectives. Too often, outsiders criticize the IMF for not doing something that it was never set out to do. So I think that's an advantage. The second is that it has complete access to information, including confidential communications among staff, between management and staff, and among executive directors. And as a result of that, not only is it able to identify vulnerabilities, but also it is able to make very concrete and granular suggestions about not only the objectives, but also the decision-making process. And I think that's very valuable. Now, I must say that it did take a while for the staff to become fully comfortable with the level of access to information that the IEO has, but I think that the staff has internalized that access. And on that point, Moises, you talked about the defensiveness of staff in IEO evaluations. I want to push back just a little. I think that being evaluated is a difficult process. And in some respects, the learning process is also about learning how to be evaluated. But I do believe that staff does differentiate its reactions depending on the evaluation report in question. Some are considered to be more fair and more balanced than others. So I wouldn't say it's a generalized defensiveness. And I also would say that I think the staff has gotten better at accepting the process. Charles, you identified several issues for discussion, and I wanted to focus primarily on one, which relates to the integrity and legitimacy of the IMF's technical analysis and the concern that you've identified regarding, quote, undue political interference. It's a really important concern, and I would like to drill down on it a little bit. You mentioned that the evaluations of Argentina in 2004 and the Greek program in 2016. In both cases, the staff's judgment was that the debt of these countries was unsustainable and therefore needed to be restructured. And as a result of considerable political pressure, the restructuring was delayed. The origin of the pressure were capitals. And I would note that in the case of Greece, it was not just European capitals, but clearly it was transmitted through the executive board. And of course, the board's position is critical because it is an executive board. People, outsiders may not realize this. It's not a supervisory board. It makes all of the country-specific decisions and all of the policy decisions. So a key question for me on this topic is the extent to which the board always strikes an appropriate balance between its institutional responsibilities and its political responsibilities. And I do believe that the IEO has a mandate to address this question. That's why the terms of its reference provide that it should have an arm's length relationship with the board. And in the past, the IEO has made valuable recommendations on board issues, from the composition of executive directors to its work process. Now, I know this is a very nuanced and difficult issue. Clearly, executive directors express the views and cast the votes of the members that elect them. But they are also officials of the IMF who have a responsibility to ensure that the institution acts consistently with its objective. So, in the case of Greece, for example, the delay in the restructuring of Greece's debt was concerns about the fallout in the Eurozone. Clearly, executive directors had legitimate reasons to be concerned about this. But really, if you look at the IMF's mandate, the number one priority was to address Greece's balance of payments problems. And the problem is that the delay exacerbated those problems. So I don't want to overstate it. all of these issues are important. I'm not suggesting that there should be a standalone evaluation on the sort of this balancing of the board's institutional and political objectives. But I do believe that when you do ex post analysis of vulnerabilities and programs and surveillance, one might want to focus on whether or not the board is achieving that balance correctly. One word finally on the interference, the non-interference issue that you've identified, Charles. This is, of course, not a new issue, as you pointed out, and has been, the subject of considerable discussion, including in previous reviews of the IEO. And I think that there was a general recognition, even amongst those who support a robust IEO function, that there is an underlying logic to this provision and that it should be kept. And I recognize that the language is general and potentially ambiguous, but my own advice would be that it would not be fruitful to expend too much time or energy on textual modifications. While there might be differences in the application of the clause between management and the IEO, ultimately the application of this clause in cases is going to be resolved by the board. And my sense is that generally the board has been supportive of the IEO's efforts, for example, in the Eurozone crisis. So with that, I will conclude, Kalpana, and I'm happy to come back in a second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thanks all of you. What a rich discussion. Let me kick off with a couple of things. I have two broad themes, right? One is, and actually, let me just say, as Sean said, having left the fund recently and started work somewhere else at the Gates Foundation, I think I have a different perspective on the relationship between the IMF staff, management, and the IEO. And there are two things that kind of stand out for me about this whole exercise and the relationship. One is the contrast between the IMF and what I've seen so far in the foundation about our ability to prioritize work, to let things go if they're not working, and hold on to things. And I raise this because one of the points of tension between you both, Moises, you also talked about staff being defensive and so on. I don't know if staff's attitude is just defensive for the sake of it, and how much of it is related to the fact that there are real budget constraints on what the staff is able to do, and what staff see as new and additional demands from the recommendations and the management implementation plans and so on. So my question, I guess, is what role do you all see in this relationship with the board? Also helping the board prioritize and thereby possibly getting better traction for your recommendations. And I think it goes a little bit to the broad one of the three mandates, which is to support executive board's institutional governance and oversight. And the second question relates to something that Charles said, which he hadn't read, which is, working with others at the IMF is something that, the fund staff need to do better. And that's, again, a contrast to where I'm now working, is much more openness to learning from others. So one possibility is to think about when the IEO comes up with recommendations, not only that they're smart, but also that they bring in actual exemplars from other organizations that might, and you talked about collaborating with other independent evaluation offices. So I think much more about the how to do some of these things for an organization that is sort of one of a kind, but that there are comparisons that could be useful. So let me see if anybody, Charles or any of the discussants, wants to comment on those before I turn it over to the audience. Are we getting, Charles, are we getting people to actually speak up or just send questions in the chat?
I think the first stage for people to send questions in the chat. For some reason, my chat function isn't working, so I don't see whether people have sent questions. But is yours working, Kalpana?
It is, but I don't see any questions. But okay.
Okay, so perhaps we could give some quick reactions and then give time for people to put. Maybe I could just come in since I'm speaking. I think you raised an interesting question. The IEO tends to focus on issues where people are concerned that the fund is not being effective. So typically our recommendations do suggest more work rather than less work, which has that negative aspect that you just mentioned. And I think one thing perhaps we need to focus on more is also to identify areas for resource savings or streamlining, so that when we make a set of recommendations, it's neutral rather than work increasing. But the reality is that it is quite difficult, and the governance of the board tends to support keeping what is being done and then adding more. And I'm thinking back to our financial surveillance evaluation, where we recommended a more risk-based approach to allocating financial sector resources by cutting back on the list of 29 systemic jurisdictions, which had to be done every 5 years, at the expense of doing more assessments for a broader range of countries that might have more serious financial stability issues. But I have to say that at the board discussion, that suggestion did not get much traction, because all the executive directors for countries who are on the 29 list tend to speak up and say, oh, it's so important for us, so we need to continue that. So I think one of the big questions for the fund in general is how to achieve a more rigorous prioritization, so that the fund can pivot to areas of new concern rather than just continuing issues that it's been doing for many years, where there's there's quite a lot of inertia in the fund to really shift resources to new issues. That's a problem I see. Well, let me just make that comment and cede the floor to others.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. It goes to Sean's point also about the board playing the role of kind of running the fund and having a political role. Did I, Alexandre? Yeah.
Yes, just very quick. I think the board, I mean, from the perspective of the board, the IEO can be very helpful to prioritize the evaluation process. I mean, I know that this is arm's length to the board and independent from management, but my experience being an EVC and a board member was that we could, weigh in even the smaller countries, like was the case in my case. We represented 10, 11 countries, not the main shareholders, but Brazil included, and we were able to weigh in and sort of shape the way we wanted to, or the subjects we wanted to be covered by the IEO. For example, the unconventional monetary policy was an issue for emerging markets. We have the capital flow discussion. So I think the IEO was a very important instrument for the institution to learn from these two experiences, how the policies of the IMF were taking care of those two important issues, important for the perspective of the IMF, and in this case, the work with other institutions. I think it's good. I come from an institution where collaboration among central banks is very critical. So collaboration is different from coordinating work, from writing joint reports. So I'm a bit skeptical about this. unless it's a very, very well-defined issue that you can sit with all the IFI and write joint reports. My problem here is to see dilution of the recommendations of the IMF. At the end of the day, the board has a specific responsibilities towards its shareholders, towards its towards the community, and if we put together other institutions and we have joint report, and we make an effort to find the minimum common denominator, then I think we'll be worse off than before. But collaboration is very, very important, and I support it very much.
Thank you. Moises, would you like to come in on any of this?
Yes, just briefly on some of Charles' recommendations. I think everything helps. And these recommendations would certainly move us a step forward. I'm not exactly sure what you mean in all of the details, and I think this is not exactly the place to discuss all of those. I'm just a little bit concerned about the friction that would create. So for the IEO to be more involved in management implementation plans and the follow-up process and all of that, so that generates an additional layer of friction. And my basic point from my experience at the IEO is that we need to reduce this friction. So it's okay to be involved, but at some point the IEO has to step back and say, well, this is what we have done, and you deal with that. So we are not, the IEO is not really responsible for making sure all the implementation is being done. I take Sean's comment that staff has getting better in receiving the evaluations and understanding and digesting the evaluations. So that's certainly music to my ears, and I certainly welcome the development. On integrity issues, not sure exactly what it means. More current issues. So that has the political element that some of you have already mentioned. Political interference. At the end of the day, we have to understand that these institutions and the IMF is a political institution. So that's it. And executive directors, as Sean mentioned, will have two hats. One, understanding the IMF role and defending the IMF and so on. But at the same time, they are representatives of the current international corporate tax system and its problems. There is some interference there. That's not political interference, but we have some interference.
We provide a staff assessment of the agreement.
I wonder if we can mute that. Okay. So regarding political interference, so that's always going to be there because these institutions and the IMF is also a political entity and decisions are political. What we have to keep in mind and what we have to make sure is that the technical analysis is not affected by political interference. So at the end of the day, decisions are taken by management and the executive board, taking into consideration many elements, technical and political, and the particular situation, circumstances, and whatnot. But what I would insist is that the technical analysis, what is being brought to the table for the discussions, is completely technical, apolitical, without political interference. So once you have all the elements there, so let the decision makers make decisions and then be accountable for their decisions. And if there is a political element that no one else is seeing, so well, that's the prerogative of management, that's the prerogative of the board. But staff needs to be open and say, well, this is the best way we see this. If there is political interference because, well, bringing the example of the Greek crisis where there could be contagion to other countries and events that the IEO or others are not seeing, but politicians are very concerned of, so you make a political decision and that's the way I think it should proceed. But make sure that staff is not affected by these political decisions, interference, and brings things to the table that is precisely what politicians would like to see. So I guess this is an important element that needs to be stressed. I'll stop here for now.
Yeah, I'm going to, Neri, I'm going to call on you you said you had a question for Sean.
Actually, it's a question for everybody. That Sean's comments elicited, and that's when we speak. Everybody is now speaking about the board and political pressure, as though the board is a board of equals. When actually the problem for the fund is that the board is not a board of equals. There's a huge asymmetry of political power on the board. So when we speak about undue influence, we're not talking about undue influence coming through every one of the board. We're talking about it coming through the most powerful members of the board on the whole. And therefore, I think the role of the IEO is not to, the role of the IEO in that is actually a really important one, which is to reinforce the multilateral character of the fund by informing a board which is so asymmetrically supplied with both information and power. And the asymmetry goes not just to the power of countries sitting on the board and the structure of the constituencies on the board, but it also goes to the relationship between the offices of the executive directors and the staff and management of the fund. And so to me, the IEO's role there is very, very clear, which is to strengthen the board's oversight as a multilateral board. I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you, Neri. Let me allow Sean, why don't you respond? And then I'll take one more question before we wrap.
Sure. So first of all, Kalpana, I'm glad I came in after Nairi, because I completely agree with her that this is one of the issues, is the asymmetry in the board. And this has manifested itself in many of the observations of the IEO in previous evaluations, whether it be the lead up to the financial crisis or the Eurozone crisis. So I think Nairi's point is very well taken. If I could just respond to Moises's point, however, is it, in my view, in my experience as a staff member, it's difficult to make this binary distinction between the technical analysis of the staff and management on the one hand, and the political role of the board on the other hand. Why? Because the board adopts policies which by their terms are supposed to be based on exclusively economic considerations. So, and those policies are binding not only on staff and management, Moises, but binding on the board. So it's uncomfortable for the board to be explicitly political, because by its own policies, it's not supposed to be. And that creates this lack of transparency as to what is going on. And that creates pressure on the staff to retrofit what is a politically convenient solution through a technical guise. And that's part of the problem.
Thank you, Sean. There's a lot to unpack in here, but I'm glad we got these issues out on the table, and maybe they'll come out again in future sessions. Roger, do you want to come in with your question?
Sure. Thanks, Kalpana. My question goes to the I in the IEO and its independence. I'm old enough to remember the times before we had an IEO. Like many of those on this panel, I was working in what is now SPR. We were evaluating our own work. I'm sure we felt that we were doing so independently, but of course we weren't, because we were part of staff. An IEO was created in part to try to build a more independent assessment. But as we see, the IEO is, of course, in many ways also very close to the institution, with all the advantages that Sean set out. A lot of ex-IMF staff go to the IEO, and the IEO draws a lot on staff. How do you gain this advantage of being independent while not losing the credibility by being possibly too close to the institution that you are actually evaluating? And I mean, all of you are well placed to answer this question, so I'll leave it up to you to choose who would like to take that on. Thanks.
Charles, maybe I toss it to you first.
That's certainly a key challenge, and I think in the end you have to have a balance. I mean, I myself worked on fund staff for many years, but I also worked outside the fund for 8 years before taking on the director role, and I think that really helped to give me perspective on the institution that I didn't have after my career on fund staff. And certainly, as I look to hire people for the IEO, both on the IEO staff and as consultants, I'm looking to make sure we have a balance between people from the inside who really understand the institution, who are respected by the people in the institution, and can really help, I think, to shape our assessment and recommendations in a way that it can be more readily accepted by fund staff. It sort of goes to Moises' point about learning. It's easier to learn from someone who you really know understands the issues well. But at the same time, it's also really important, as you mentioned, to make sure that we have that external perspective. In fact, we are required by our terms of reference to have over half of our staff from the outside. And I also make sure that when we hire consultants, we have a good mix between the external consultants and the internal consultants to make sure that we are not getting too close to fund staff, as you suggested. Although I have to say that my IMF consultants tend to be really good in their post-fund careers, being quite rigorous and quite critical. I think they quite enjoy that opportunity to come to the IEO and to really say things that perhaps they didn't feel comfortable saying when they were inside the institution. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Charles. No, having known many of your ex-IMF retirees, I think you're quite right. Any other comments from on any points raised by during the discussion before we close? Sean, anything? No, Moises?
Well, maybe just on this last question from Roger. During my time at the IEO, 7 years producing very complex evaluations because of the timing. So it's not that we decided, let's do a very complex evaluation. So I inherited the run-up to the crisis that Tom Burns initiated, but during my tenure, I was responsible to finish that report, which was very difficult to bring about. And also during my time, so we had the Greek crisis and the launching and finalization of the European crisis evaluation. So those were perhaps the most difficult ones during my time. But I have to say that during all those 7 years, I never experienced any lack of independence. I would say we felt 100% independent. So of course we were based in the same building, and some staff come for a couple of years to the IEO. Some of the consultants worked previously at the IMF, and so on and so forth. But the balance, I would say, has always been adequate. External people and people that know the IMF from the inside. But the way we operated, I am pretty sure that's the case today, total independence, and everyone knows his place and everyone knows how to behave and so on. So in that regard, I would say independence is not a question. There was a lot of pressure, I have to admit it, a lot of pressure, and perhaps being in the same building, so that created a lot of pressure from colleagues, from friends from the IMF, the executive board, on specific issues, on the timing of the evaluations, on the questions of the evaluations, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we were always able to produce what we considered an independent analysis and present it as we saw things. So that's something I would say a very positive experience, and I think that creates a lot of the credibility that the IEO has gained along the years. I would stop here.
Thanks, Moises. Alexandre, any parting words?
Well, thanks for asking. I just, well, just to say that restructuring that was used as an example of political interference, I should say, I want to leave this with you before we close, that restructuring has a potential of a huge economic and social dislocation in the countries themselves. So pushing back against that restructuring might not be simply a political pressure point, but could be also good economics. I haven't been in any decision not to restructure while I was a board member, but I just wanted to leave this idea because at the end of the day, it's the jurisdictions that feel the pain of huge economic and social dislocation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a good reality check that that these are really difficult issues and it's, no easy answers. But I think we had a very good opening session, Charles. Great presentation, great discussions, and I think we're well set up for the rest of the conference. So well done, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good to see you all.
Thanks so much, Kalpana, for really excellent moderation. I really felt that there's a very rich discussion, a lot of food for thought, difficult issues, no easy answers.